I guess, in horticulture now for nearly 30 years, originally as a commercial vegetable and a bit of fruit grower, and then more recently as an advisor and writer. I do a lot of work as well on agroforestry at the moment for both the Soil Association and also managing a 200-acre agroforestry project near Swindon for Helen Browning's farm. As you'll see during the presentation, and a lot of my experience and sort of inspiration, I guess, for woodchip came from the work that I've done at the farm. Thought I would start by just talking about sort of how I got obsessed by woodchip, which I call my Woodchip Inspiration. So there's a few trials and a few people that really got me into it. One of them, Ian Tollis, or Tolly, and has been experimenting with this for longer than I have, and some of the sort of stuff that he's been doing, seeing the effect that the woodchip was having on his farm was a big push to me getting really obsessed by it. Similarly, Glyn Percival, who's a tree advisor and scientist, researcher, we did some work around woodchip and scab disease in apples that was sort of slightly mind-blowing. And the work that the Organic Research Centre did, particularly Sally Westaway and Joe Smith around woodchip, was pretty great. And there's also an American scientist called David Granatstein, who I refer to a bit in the book, who's done some really great work on orchard systems and mulches and woodchip mulches, particularly, and looking at the relative financial impact of different mulching systems and how using woodchip actually, although it's expensive to put on, can make a big difference, and you get that money back from increased cropping. So when you're using it in a more commercial sense, it makes a lot of sense. That's a picture of my two children who can't resist climbing up a pile of wood when they see one. It's a relatively recent material in some ways. The first wood chipper was invented in 1884 by a German chap called Peter Jensen, and he invented it to deal with the prunings that were coming out of the local parks. History doesn't sort of recall what he actually did with his wood chips, but the company does still make machines to this day, so it's obviously a successful business. Any part really of a tree can be chipped or shredded with the right piece of kit. You know, I mean, you could do it with a pair of secateurs and a sledgehammer in your back garden if you only had a few bits, but obviously at any scale you need something heavy duty, and you know, right up from those sort of rather pathetic little electric things that just deal with shreddings in back gardens, right up to mega monster machines that would just take a whole tree and chip it up in a matter of moments, and everywhere in between. As a general rule, hiring in a bigger shredder or a bigger chipper would be my advice, rather than buying one, because you're always going to be limited by, you know, by the size of the stuff that affordable shredders and chippers can take. I came to woodchip originally, as I suspect most people did, through using it as a mulch, probably on paths or around, you know, trees or shrubs in landscaping, that sort of thing. And still one of the most effective uses of woodchip. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to look at a few ways in which it helps or it's useful. So we'll look a bit at weeds, water, temperature modulation, preventing splash, and I'll put vole control. I mean, I'll widen it slightly to sort of pest and disease control, but we've seen interesting results with voles. There's a number of ways in which a mulch will control weeds. So obviously it prevents light from getting through at its most basic, creates a barrier between the sun and the plant. But with a woodchip mulch, there's other stuff going on as well. So one of the things that, particularly if you use a fresh woodchip mulch, that it will inhibit the germination of annual weed seeds and other seeds on that mulch. So if something lands on, you know, a lovely seed bed, it's perfect conditions, it germinates and grows away. If it lands on a lump of wood that dries out very quickly, then it's not going to germinate. And then some species of woodchip also will, particularly when they're fresh, will contain chemicals, allelopathic chemicals that also inhibit germination. So you've got the physical effect of it not being a nice surface to grow on, and the chemical effect of actually of inhibiting germination in the seed. Obviously, as the mulch composts or decomposes, so the one that you can see in the picture here is sort of semi-rotted, that effect the chemical and physical will decrease, and eventually you're actually creating a lovely seed bed for annual weeds. So it's a temporary mulch in that sense. You quite often get questions about, which is the best wood chip to use, and how do I go about getting the right wood chip? Well, actually, mostly we can't choose what wood chip we get anyway, because most of us are relying on wood chip, I would say, from tree surgeon things where it's a bit mixed. Broadly speaking, I think it doesn't matter too much. They will all do a good job, and as they get older, they'll do a less good job of weed control, but they're obviously at that point starting to do a better job of adding to your soil health. So, you might decide to top up the mulch with a fresh layer, but equally, you probably don't want to be doing that forever, because it can mess around sometimes with your nutrient levels in the soil. The one thing to say about weed control is that, while chip is good for annual weeds, it won't control perennial weeds, as very little controls perennial weeds. So this is a picture of the creeping thistle finding its way through what was quite a deep wood chip mulch. And of course, what you've done is you've removed all the competition. So when they do get up through the wood chip mulch, they're lovely, they're mulched themselves, so their roots are all nice and moist and fertile. And so, of course, what you see in this picture very quickly turned into that, which is a sea of creeping thistle in seed. Now, in amongst there, this is a picture from Eastbrook Farm. In amongst there is a row of trees stretching along there. The trees will be fine. They had a good mulch. They got established. They'll grow through it. It's a bit messy. This is a grazed system, so it's not a massive problem, but if you were in a crop system, you probably would not want all of that seed floating into your vegetable or arable system. So a little word of warning, I guess, about perennial weeds. And some growers combine strategies. So they'll put on a wood chip mulch, and then they might flame weed over the top of it, or they might cultivate it after a year or two to get rid of the weeds that are done. So thinking about, as with anything, there isn't often one solution that will do everything. So thinking about it as part of an integrated weed control is probably worthwhile. And one of the things that David Grandenstein looked at was comparing the cost and efficiency of different mulching systems. So he looked at herbicides and plastic mulches, and flame weeding and cultivation. And broadly, spraying is the cheapest way of controlling weeds, but it doesn't give you any moisture control, and it doesn't give you any soil health benefits. Being on a wood chip or a compost mulch is one of the most expensive ways of controlling weeds, but the speed of establishment of the trees, and sometimes the speed of fruiting, so they'll sometimes fruit a year or two earlier if they grow really well and mature really well. And then the increased yields from those trees will more than make up for the extra cost of spreading the wood chip from the trials that he did. If we go on to water retention, this photo was actually the main catalyst to me writing the book. So what you see in this picture is a field of trees that we planted in 2017-18, so that winter just before the drought year of 2018. And off to the right, out of the photo, there's some pollarded willows. So we cut down a whole load of old willows that hadn't been pollarded for ages, and we created a big pile of wood chip, which we threw over the fence, and it landed around these trees. And I had every intention of moving it and mulching the other trees properly with it, and we never got round to it. So these trees on the left, the small ones, had a very small sprinkling of wood chip from somewhere else. And the trees on the right had about 2.5 foot, 3 foot of mulch. They were all planted on the same day. So that tree and that tree were planted literally on the same day. They're the same stock from the same nursery. The ones on the left, 4 years later, are still probably just above my waist, and the ones on the right are about 12 foot tall. And that, I think, mainly down to the water retention properties in that very drought year on a species, willow, that is, particularly prone to drying out. So it really benefited from having that moisture. There may have been a temperature benefit as well, but I think the main thing was water retention. And there's lots of studies looking at mulching and soil moisture, and they tend to show about a 25% increase in soil moisture if you have a 10 to 15 centimetre layer of mulch, or a reduction of 25% in irrigation needs, for instance. The thicker the mulch, the more it will hold the water in, up to a point. So as with anything, it's a balance of how much mulch have you got, how much time have you got to spread it, how many trees or plants are you trying to mulch. But certainly from this experiment, it would seem that having a really, really deep mulch helped. It's quite striking. The temperature modulation was something that I hadn't really thought about until I started researching for the book. Most plants don't thrive in extreme temperatures. So they might survive, but they don't tend to like it really cold or really hot. And in the same way, most soil organisms are most active at about 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. So the fungi can cope a bit better with colder temperatures, and bacteria can cope a bit better with hot temperatures. But broadly speaking, all of them prefer to be in that sort of mid-range temperature. A mulch, and particularly wood chip mulch, will help to modulate that temperature. So it will keep the soil cooler in hot weather, and particularly it slows down how quickly it heats up. So in the morning, if you've got really hot sun beating down, it will delay the heating up of the soil for a few hours. And then in cold weather, it can keep the soil warm, up to 10 degrees warmer with a thick mulch. So there's a real opportunity to protect the biology in your soil by using mulches, as well as, of course, as feeding that biology with the organic matter. Probably most of you have noticed if you've got bare soil and really heavy rain, particularly if you've got sort of big drops of rain, when it hits the bare soil, it splashes back up, and the bottoms of your plants can get all a bit sort of muddy and splashy. And in amongst all of that mud is a lot of disease spore. They land on the plant if they're sort of in this muddy stuff all over the leaf. Then that's a perfect environment for them to grow, and you can get problems with disease around the bottom of plants. A mulch will not only stop the splashing, but it reduces the disease. So there was a trial in America with box plants. So there's when you trim box hedges, they get particularly susceptible to box blight, and because also you tend to have them cut low to the ground as well. So they did a trial with a mulch, and they saw a 97% decrease in disease on the plants when they had a wood chip mulch. And there were two things I think was happening. One was, so they put the mulch down after the leaves had dropped. So although box is evergreen, there is some leaf drop in the autumn. So they put the mulch on after that, which created a physical barrier between the disease spores and the plant. And then also when it rained, it stopped some of the splashing, and the splashing that did happen was effectively clean water back from the wood chip. And with rain becoming increasingly heavy, I would say, with climate change, we tend to be getting rain less often, but more of it could be a really useful property. And of course, the mulch will protect the soil surface anyway, and to help reduce some of that surface compaction and damage that you get from driving and walking on the soil. And then pests is a nice little violet's quite sweet there, doesn't he, munching away at his worm. But I'm sure a lot of you have suffered vole damage, and particularly on newly planted trees. What we found, we did quite a lot of experimenting with mulch mats, which I've come to hate with a passion. I think they, apart from the fact they're really fiddly to put down, you got to peg them in, and then what do you use? You use these plastic pegs that stick in the soil forever, or you're trying to use, wooden stakes, and they're always breaking. And then once they're in, they create a lovely protected environment for the voles who make their home under this little nice waterproof roof, and they nibble away at the roots of your trees underneath. And then if you mulch on top of them, you're insulating their house for them. So they've got a lovely warm house that they can live in under near the tree roots and nibble away at it. What we found where we put the wood chip directly on the soil around the trees and not using a mat is that we didn't get any vole damage. And I think that probably what's happening is it's falling into the runs. They don't like it. It's not creating a covered environment, so they're more vulnerable to attack from predators. If you imagine you've got this clean wood chip space around the tree. If they go on that, they're going to be visible and vulnerable. And it seems that they keep away from the tree roots and find other stuff to eat in the pasture. So although we have lots and lots of voles, we haven't seen very much vole damage at all where we've mulched directly onto the soil. And then in terms of some of the other pests and disease, I think there's very little work has been done on single species wood chips, and I think that's probably the big area for research. We did, as part of the Innovative Farmers program, we did a trial with willow wood chip, and this was something that Glyn Percival had noticed in a previous trial, that the apple trees that had been mulched with willow seemed to have less scab on them. And we wanted to see if we could replicate that in orchard situations. So we worked with some cider growers down in Somerset, and we did see a trend to reduced scab in those that had been mulched with willow. It wasn't conclusive. The theory is that the salicylic acid seems to stimulate an immune reaction in the plants in the same way that when we take aspirin, it helps us recover. There's no reason, Glyn thinks, why that effect wouldn't also happen on other diseases. So we happen to be looking at scab, but it's quite possible it would work on other diseases. The reason he thinks we didn't see such a conclusive result as he'd hoped was a number of things potentially. So one is that there is significantly different levels of salicylic acid in different willow species, and not all of the trialists were using ones with the highest levels. So choice of willow species is crucial. Timing is also crucial. So you have to cut it in February, or sort of now-ish, February, March, when the growth is just starting and the salicylic acid levels are highest in the chip. And then you have to use it within a couple of weeks because it's quite soluble. So you want to get the chip on the ground around the tree so that it leaches out into the root system of the tree rather than sort of wherever you're storing the pile of chip. And then the final reason was he doesn't think that some of the growers put enough chip around their trees, and the growers were nervous because cider apples are collected mostly by machine, so they're sort of swept off the ground, and they didn't want lots of wood chip coming up in the machine, so they didn't put as much on as he recommended sometimes. So I think there's definitely opportunities to do some more work on that. And then there was another really interesting study looking at using a wood chip mulch to help reduce one of the apple pests, and the larvae from this pest loved overwintering in the wood chip. So you think, well, that's slightly counterintuitive. You put the wood chip down, you're actually encouraging the pest, but actually what they were then able to do was treat the pest with a biological control, and it was much more effective when they treated the mulch than when they tried to treat the soil, which the larvae would otherwise have been in. So they had a much better hit rate on the larvae and reduced the pest levels significantly. So that's using the physical properties of the mulch in a sort of integrated pest management kind of way. So there's lots still to explore with how we use wood chip to help us in our control of pests and diseases. If we broaden out slightly from just the mulch, it's worth thinking about, once that wood breaks down, what does it do for your soil? How is it useful? So I'd start by looking at worms, and again, visiting Tolly's farm was just incredible with this. He, as part of the trials he did with the Organic Research Centre, they actually counted his worms in his soil. And I think I'm right in saying, if I've got my figures right, Tolly can always correct me in the chat, but if I'm wrong, his estimate is that he's got more than 3 million worms an acre. So that's tons of things. And it's much higher than Darwin estimated in his original treatise on earthworms, which is still very worthwhile reading and very relevant. So we know that adding wood chip to soil will help your worms. There's other studies. There's a Canadian and a study that also showed that worm populations increased when you add Uranial wood chip or composted wood chip. And even in the 1950s, there was a study that showed a threefold increase in earthworms when you added hardwood chips. So there's lots of evidence that it will help your worm count. And this picture here, I mean, this surprised me. So if you look at the wood chip in this picture, it's not very broken down. And there's still some quite big chunks of relatively fresh wood chip in there. And this pile of chip is on a concrete pad. It's not even on the soil. But already, the worms were coming in quite big numbers into it. And I've sometimes heard people go, "Oh, don't put wood chip in your wormery. They hate it. They hate it." But I suspect it's about the quantity and the type of wood chip. Maybe someone's put fresh cedar wood or chip in or something where it's got a chemical that the worms don't like. But certainly, composted wood chip is no problem at all to worms. And even looking at that photo, even relatively fresh wood chip. And there are occasional sort of risks. So, for instance, there was one study that showed that if you look around a walnut tree, there's not as many worms because they've got this allelopathic chemical. But I couldn't see much evidence that the wood chip on its own would have that effect. And certainly all the evidence I've seen suggests that any of those potentially harmful chemicals in fresh wood chip break down pretty quickly within 3 to 6 months. So if you are worried about any particular sort of batch you've had or a particular species, then leaving it to compost for 3 to 6 months will almost certainly remove pretty much all the risk of harming anything in the soil. And the other big thing, obviously, a benefit of wood chip is that it will build your soil fungi. So wood chip is mostly broken down by fungi rather than bacteria. Bacteria are not strong enough to break into the woody lignin cells, and they also need higher levels of nitrogen. Fungi are able to function on much lower levels of nitrogen. They do need some, and that's why you get this nitrogen robbing occasionally. So the fungi will sort of scavenge around a little bit for nitrogen to help them. Obviously, if you see a big old trunk which has virtually no nitrogen in, the mushrooms will still get in there and start to break it down. So they can cope with very low levels of nitrogen. Building soil carbon, you've got the wood itself, obviously, is adding some carbon, some organic matter to the soil. But fungi and mushrooms are also able to sequester their own carbon and fix their own carbon. So they bring actually loads of carbon in through that increased fungal material as well. So it's just a really good thing to be doing. And I'm sure a lot of you have come across this concept of the fungal and bacterial ratio in soils. So soils, when they're very young, it's when a volcano erupts and you get sort of raw molten lava that cools and hardens, nothing grows on it initially. And then, bacteria and lichen comes in, they start to break down some of that mineral. And then eventually you get little plants growing. Still, it's very bacterial dominated. As the plants get bigger and drop their leaves and you build up a depth of soil, that's when the sort of the woody plants and the fungi start to come in. And for a lot of our plants, prefer sort of slightly fungal dominated soil, particularly shrubs and trees. And the more we cultivate soils and grow things in them or spray them, the more we're killing off fungi. So arable soils, particularly horticultural soils, tend to move away from that fungal domination towards a more bacterial soil. And by putting some of this wood chip back in and building up the fungal populations, you can help the plants that are growing in it as well. And I will cover nitrogen robbing at this point as well, because it does always come up, and it's one of the things I think that has limited the uptake of wood chip use. Nitrogen robbing is where you put wood chip on and it sucks the nitrogen from around it, and therefore the plants that are trying to grow in it go, "Oh, I haven't got enough nitrogen, I can't grow." It does happen. It is a risk, but it's quite a minor risk in my opinion. And there's a couple of things just to be really aware of to stop it happening. So the first is never dig in fresh wood chip. So even ramial wood chip, which is much higher in nitrogen, I would not dig in. I'd always spread it on the surface. So what seems to happen is that where so if I imagine that that's a bit of wood chip, and where it touches the soil is where it robs the nitrogen, usually it seems to be within about a centimetre of where it touches the soil. So if you imagine you're just spreading it on the surface, it's only going to rob nitrogen from that top let's say top 1 centimetre, maybe 2 centimetres of soil. So if you're mulching a tree, the tree roots are going to be down a good foot. Once they start growing even more than that, they're not going to be affected by that small loss of nitrogen in the top layer. Where you'll see problems is where you dig it in. So if I dig all of these wood chip in and they're all over the surface of the soil, then obviously they're touching soil all around them and everything's touching. And that way they're going to be sucking nitrogen from as deep as you've dug it into. So don't dig in fresh. If you're at all worried, compost it, because as soon as it's after 6 months or 9 months, it will already have started breaking down. And although it might still need some nitrogen, it will also be releasing nitrogen as those organisms sort of breed and die and the material's broken down. Where I have seen problems is I mulched raspberries with wood chip, and I think because they're very shallow rooted, I think they did get affected. And I've heard other people saying actually they've had problems mulching raspberries with wood chip as well. So there are, I think, I wouldn't put them on shallow rooted veg. I wouldn't put uncomposted wood chip on shallow rooting veg, for instance. So it's just being aware of how it might react. And the other big no-no is using sawdust or as a mulch, because that's, in a way, you've massively increased the surface area of that material by grinding up small. And it's usually, if it's from a sawmill, for instance, it will be really dead, really old wood. It will have no nitrogen in it at all. And some of the really big problems you see will come from using sawdust. But generally, as long as you don't dig it in, or you compost it, you should be fine and not see nitrogen rubbing. Some of you I know are on a sort of slightly bigger scale. I mean, we've done a lot of moving wood chip about with wheelbarrows and trailers, and it's actually it's not the worst way to do it. It's a relatively light material. I would always use a good manure fork to spread it rather than a shovel, and it's so much easier because it sort of goes into the pile really easily. On even a sort of, anything up to a few acres, actually, if you've got a front-loading tractor and you can load the trailer mechanically, then spreading it by hand is not a bad call. You get to put it exactly where you want it, and you can drive to where it's got to go. But where you're planting in any scale, it's worth thinking about how we mechanize. So this picture here is part of a 400-meter row of trees that we were putting in, and we ended up using a feed wagon, so what the farmers normally would use to put out their silage for the cattle, and we slightly adapted it with a slightly longer chute. And we mulched 400 meters in, but actually then decided it was quicker just to do one side and quickly. Is that you don't need to chip it, take it away, compost it, bring it back. You take a lot of the operations out of the equation. It also would make use of a material that is not useful for other things particularly. So a lot of wood has other demands on it, whether it's, at the moment, obviously wood chip is hugely in demand for biomass. But, even for timber and other things, there's lots of uses we can put our trees to. But the small stuff, the brash, the trimmings, that come off during that process generally haven't had a use or a market. So they tend, some of it's gone into landfill in the past, which is terrible. Some other times it's just been burnt. So a lot of forestry operations, they just make a big bonfire and get rid of it that way. If we could chip it and just spread it in situ, then that would be a brilliant way of harnessing that resource and using it to build our soil. And from my point of view, in terms of agroforestry systems, actually thinking about how we create a system where you get the benefit of the tree when it's growing. So, it might be for biodiversity or for shelter and shade or feeding livestock. But then you can coppice it and turn it into chip and spread it on the soil around there. To me, that seems a perfect way of building a system and reducing your need for inputs, really thinking about it as that whole farm plan. Especially wood chip for fertile soils, I think I'm right in saying, which trialled spreading wood chip on 3 different farms. So Tolly was one of them, Wakeland's agroforestry farm was another, and then there was a conventional arable farmer in Hampshire who also ran a wood recycling business. So So he had all the equipment to spread it. The results basically showed that it gave advantages and didn't seem to give any disadvantages. So it was positive in that sense, but equally a lot more study needed in terms of the actual benefits and the long-term benefits. You know, there were some odd little things came up. So I remember, I think Tolly said that year 2, he saw one crop suddenly didn't seem to be doing so well with the ramial, but then, you know, it was hard to tell exactly what that meant. So there's still lots more work to be done on it, but I would say it's pretty low risk in terms of, I almost certainly will give benefits. And you can see from this picture, when you're putting on soil, you're not putting a lot on. It's not a sort of massive mulch. It's as if you're spreading muck. It's a sort of soil amendment. It's a boost. You're not looking for fertility or mulching particularly. And I know that Tolly sort of recommends putting it on during the fertility building phase of the rotation. But Richard, the farmer in Hampshire, actually was putting it onto bare soil before planting and didn't see any ill effects. So yeah, lots of potential, I think, but understudied. Here's a picture from Scotland, from Al, and I can't quite remember the name of his business off the top of my head. But so you can see the snow on the ground. So he's been creating raised beds, putting ramial wood chip on as a mulch. I don't know how well that worked, is the short answer. I think because it's going on in winter, it's already got a bit of a chance to break down before you plant anything into it. So I think it would be fine. I have to say my instinct generally would be to compost wood chip before putting it on raised beds or on around veg. But equally, I'd be really interested in doing some experiments with putting ramial on fresh and seeing what happens. And again, I suspect it depends a little bit on the crop. So my guess is that something like squash would cope quite well, whereas, something like radish might struggle. Not that you'd mulch radish, but you know what I mean. It's probably some crops that would be fine and others that might not be. But I'd love to see some more experiments using ramial wood chip in a whole range of systems. Fred Bonestrew, some of you will know, who's another one of my inspirations. He's done quite a lot with wood chip as well, but one of the things he's done is create these hotbeds using wood chip. The concept of the hotbed is millennia old. The Romans were using it. You capture the heat given off by, usually it's been rotting manure, and you use it to grow things that either more quickly or things that are more tender. What Fred's done is he's using it for his propagation unit. And what he's found with the wood chip is that it gives a longer lasting and more even heat than manure. So manure will heat up more quickly and get hotter, but then it also seems to cool down more quickly, whereas the wood chip, and again, he's using ramial wood chip with the higher nitrogen content, the wood chip heats up a little bit more slowly, but stays at an even temperature. He sort of gets it up to about 20-25 degrees and lasts long enough for him to do all of his propagation. And then obviously once it's composted during that time, you can then spread it. He then just sort of spreads it on the beds in the tunnel, so it's all in the right place. So it's great if you don't have electricity. It's a really great way of creating a heated propagation space. And speaking of propagation, again, this was something that I hadn't considered initially with wood chip, but that Tolly had been experimenting with. And we did another innovative farmers trial with him. And we looked, it was leeks and brassicas, and we trialed them between his own homemade wood chip compost and leading peat-based compost, the Classman's peat compost. And we also put biochar in both of those, so there were 4 different treatments. And basically his compost performed as well as the peat-based commercial compost. So there's really no difference between the germination and the performance of the seedlings. The only significant difference there that we saw was that the compost with wood chip and biochar had lower leaf rust in the crops when they were harvested. So they sort of monitored the crops from the trial as well. Again, I mean, it's hard to know exactly why, but possibly it's because they were more biologically active. So the plant was a bit healthier and able to get going quicker, or able to resist the disease when it came in. But effectively what Tolly has shown is that you can you can produce what is a relatively low tech, easy thing to produce. You can do it on farm from simple ingredients, and you can create something that is as good as buying a really good commercial product in. And he's done the economics on it as well, and it works out similar in price if you sort of factor in all of your labor and all the rest of it. I mean, my guess is actually, since we've done that trial, the price of compost might have gone up, so it might actually even be cheaper now to make your own. I don't know if I've done that. But. So yeah, so it was a really interesting trial. That picture on the left is his strawberries, and as you can see, you know, they look fantastic. And the picture on the right is Fred's, actually, where he's just planted some squashes into the piles that are waiting. So even while if you're composting wood chip, while it's sat there composting, you can still use it. You can grow things in it, and you know, certain crops will grow really, really well just in the composting wood chip. Not to mention mushrooms as well, of course. So I will just quickly explain how Tolly makes the compost. So he gets good quality wood chip from a tree surgeon. So it is important to have a good relationship with your tree surgeon. We've got 3 tree surgeons at Eastbrook that drop stuff off, and 2 of them are really good, and it's really good quality. And one of them we occasionally get tree trunks, and you know, we've even had the odd chainsaw helmet and thing left in there. You know, making sure that the tree surgeon understands what you want is helpful. That might get harder. You know, I have heard that in certain parts of the country, it's getting harder to get hold of free wood chip. I think it will become more in demand. It's possible that you get less say in what you get, but most of it's fine. It's what you don't want is, you don't want, you know, old pallets chipped up or anything with paint on, or big lumps of stuff. So it's, you know, it's really just being able to talk to the tree surgeon, understanding what's in it. He lays it out in windrows. He does add some of his pack house waste, so there's a little bit of vegetable waste in there, but it's really a relatively small part of it. He turns it a few times during the year, and that's just making sure that all of the chip sort of has a turn in a way of being in the middle of the heap and gets composted. Then most of that chip he'll spread out on the field as as that soil amendment that we mentioned earlier, but a small proportion of it he'll pile up for another 6 months. So it gets 18 months altogether. And then by the time it's got to that stage, it basically looks like compost anyway. It needs sieving because there's a few sort of bigger lumps of wood in there. So effectively at that point you sieve it, and you can use it almost, you know, as it is. I think Tolly now sort of adds bits of vermiculite or perlite into it, you know, so you can add in other amendments if you need to make it sort of a bit freer draining or lighter, but effectively the main bulk of the material is just composted wood chip sieved. I was really nervous when I started using wood chip about disease. And especially kind of, you know, I'm mulching trees basically. So you're thinking, okay, I'm taking potentially diseased trees and I'm mulching my trees. I've become much less worried about it as I've gone on. And there's a few reasons. So one is that diseases tend to attack old, weak, dying trees. They tend not to be the main cause of disease. I know we've mentioned acid dieback, so I will come to that. Usually, with most diseases, it's the dying trees that are the problem. And you're mulching, you tend to mulch your newly planted, vigorous, young, healthy trees. So broadly, that's a good starting point. Secondly, often diseases are quite specific or tend to attack one tree rather than another. So scab, for instance, there are lots of different strains of scab, and some of them will affect one variety more than others. So this is one of the advantages of having a mixed orchard. You'll slow the spread of disease across the orchard because of, you know, this particular strain of scab that loves discovery won't be quite as virulent against Ashmead's kernel. So, you know, when it hits that, it slows down. So even within a species, you'll have different strains of disease that might not affect the trees you've got as much as the one that they've come from. The third point is that usually the spores of the disease are not carried in the wood chip. So often it's in the air. So ash dieback, for instance, is everywhere. We can't do anything about that. You're going to get it. It's not in the wood chip usually. There might be some, but not that much. And also, if you're composting it, those disease spores will very quickly break down. So if you've got composted wood chip, the risk of disease, I would say, is almost nothing. So I'm not saying there's no risk. I'm not saying you couldn't have a disaster, but I think generally the risk is very low. And particularly if you're then using it on vegetable beds, I think the risk is pretty much zero, because it's going to be different diseases that have affected the trees. As with anything, if you're particularly worried about a particular batch, and maybe it wouldn't be sensible to mulch all your fresh young ash trees with ash dieback, but to be honest, nobody's planting ash very much at the moment anyway. So I think generally don't worry about it, but it's not to say that you should forget about it totally. If you get a batch that you're worried about, then I would compost it before spreading it. Woodchip works really well in no-dig systems. I think using it well composted would be my preference. And I think, as with any soil amendment, use in moderation. So it's a really good way of establishing a bed or mulching for the first few years. I wouldn't be putting on thick layers of woodchip every year. I think you would see imbalances starting to form. But to put on the thick layer to start with, to establish the system, and then a little sprinkling every year to keep it going, I think that probably is going to work and will be fine. As with anything, monitor it, look at the health of the plants. If you start seeing problems, then change what you're doing. But it's lower in nitrogen than a lot of composts and manures. So I think the risk of sort of over manuring, I think, is reduced using woodchip. But again, not to say it's without any risk. And certainly, people like Charles Dowding have used woodchip and see it as a very valuable and useful material for no-dig systems. So where can you get it? I've just realised I've got the American version of this slide on. I do apologise. That shouldn't say Get Chip Drop. That should say Arb Talk. So there's a website called Arb Talk, which is run by tree surgeons, and you can register yourself as a tip site. So go on, you say, yeah, I'm up for getting some woodchip, and you put in your postcode or your address. It helps if you're easy access. If you've got a nice concrete pad they can come and dump on. If it's a tricky site, they're less likely to come to you. The reason I think we get a lot at Eastbrook is it's, they can come in, there's no gates to open, it's easy to drive in, we've got a big concrete pad. Now that we know them, we're happy for them to just come in and dump whenever. We don't have to be there. So it's really easy. For one of them, it's on his way home, so it just suits him. If you're in an awkward site and it's difficult to get to, it might be harder. And I have also heard, as just a slight word of warning, that there are some unscrupulous people that use the site to case out joints for stealing kit. So if you've got lots of expensive kit right near where you're getting it dropped, that might be worth bearing in mind. Or just being really sort of vetting the company that says they're going to drop it first. But hopefully that's the minority. I think mostly they're good. If that's not an option for you, on a very small scale, you can buy it in little bags, 80 litres. I'm guessing for most CSAs that's going to be prohibitively expensive, about £10 a bag. The next option is a ton bag, which I've seen priced at anything between £60 and £150. Somebody's making some money on that. Again, I think for commercial purposes, I don't think that's really, that's still aimed at garden market. Sometimes power companies have to clear the lines. They'll clear the trees under power cables, and sometimes, often they just leave it nowadays, but sometimes they'll have stuff they need to clear. So keeping an eye on that, or registering with power companies. And then this is Wakelands, where they're effectively growing their own woodchip. And certainly, I would say for farmers and CSAs, if you've got any space, then growing some of your own woodchip, I think, is the best way to do it. You've got control. You know what's going into it. You can look at single species, which is interesting. You get the benefits of having the trees on your site as well. So, obviously there's still a cost to it. You have to buy or hire a machine in to deal with it, but it's a pretty cost-effective way of getting a really good material. And you can do it without it taking up too much space. It's a good way of edging beds, creating microclimates. So, I would definitely recommend, if you have any land, it's a really good way of getting woodchip, is to grow your own. But for most of us, tree surgeons, I would say, still provide the bulk of woodchip. One thing that is worth thinking about, I think, particularly for CSAs, is looking at community chipping. This is Tolly, so this isn't actually community chipping. This is him dealing with his own. but it was a group of people and some wood chip, which illustrated the point. So green waste composting effectively, or green composting which the councils do, is to some extent is this, but it's got to a scale where the quality of the material is mostly pretty poor. So getting green waste compost or green compost is, there's often plastic in it, there's usually glass in it, and there's a risk of aminopyralid weed killer in it. Whereas if you've got a small group, your own community, your members that can bring their own stuff to chip, you could hire the chipper and go round to your members and chip their stuff and collect the wood chip. I think there's some real potential ways to bring some woody waste when they pick up their veg, if you've got somewhere to store it. So there's opportunities, I think, for collecting and creating a higher quality material than there is through the municipal collection schemes. So I think that's something that's worth thinking about. And that's me. I hope equally as enthused as I am, or maybe not quite my level of obsession, but yeah, I'm always amazed by how we can turn trees into effectively that. That stuff is brilliant, and we don't do enough of it. So thank you for listening.